60 million people believe they have already been inside this house. They watched the family drift down its great staircase. They watched the footman carry in the silver, watched a world of candlelight and calm. But almost everything they saw was a performance, and the truth behind it was stranger and far harder than the television ever dared to film. Behind that famous front stood a hidden army of women and men who woke in the dark, climbed stairs no guest ever saw, and were forbidden to be noticed at all. This is what it was really like inside the real Downton Abbey. If you love the stories the history books leave in the servants' hall, subscribe now and stay with me, because the real house is far stranger than the one you think you know. Chapter 1. The House 60 Million People Misread. Every year, a great tide of visitors comes to Hampshire to walk through a house they are certain they already understand, and they are wrong. They arrive from across the world, and above all from across the Atlantic, because they have seen this place 100 times without ever setting foot in it. They have watched its great staircase, its library, its long panelled saloon. They have watched a family sweep through its rooms in silk and black tie, while an army of servants moved around them like clockwork. They believe they know it. They know a story about it. That is a very different thing. The house is Highclere Castle, and it stands in the county of Hampshire, in the south of England, about 5 miles south of the town of Newbury. To the wider world, it has one name only. It is the real Downton Abbey, the house that played an aristocratic family's estate on television and in the films that followed, from 2010 onward. The towered outline that opens every episode, honey-coloured against the grey English sky, is not a set. It is Highclere itself, filmed with almost no dressing at all, because the house already looked the part it was asked to play. And that is exactly the problem. Because the television series is a warm and gentle fiction. It is a world where the butler is kind, where the family knows the servants by name and worries over their troubles, where the two halves of the house lean on each other like a single family under one roof. It is beautiful. Tens of millions of people have loved it, and they were right to. But it is not what this house was. The real Highclere, in the years this film explores, the long Victorian and Edwardian decades on either side of the year 1900, was something harder and stranger and far more interesting. It was not a home so much as an engine. It was a vast and complicated machine, built of stone and staffed by human beings, and its single purpose was to produce an effect. The effect was ease. The effect was calm. The effect was a family that appeared to float through life without effort, in warm rooms and clean linen, at tables that filled and cleared as if by magic. To produce that effect took an enormous hidden population. It took people who rose before dawn and worked until midnight. It took people who were forbidden, by the rules of the house, to be seen at all. And it took money the family did not have, brought in from outside, from one of the richest banking fortunes in Europe, simply to keep the whole performance running for one more year. This is the house the tour walks past. Visitors today are shown the staterooms, the library, the drawing rooms where the cameras rolled. They are shown the front of the machine, the polished surface it was designed to present. What this film does is open the other doors. The doors to the kitchens and the sculleries, the doors to the back stairs and the servants' hall, the narrow doors, covered in green cloth, that separated the family's world from the working one, and that the family preferred never to think about. Behind those doors lived the real story of Highclere. Not the earl and his daughters in their finery, though they are here too. The real story is the housekeeper with her heavy ring of keys, the footman matched to his fellow by the inch, the scullery maid, whose hands were in cold water before the sun came up. It is the story of how a handful of people were kept in comfort by the ceaseless labour of dozens, and of how that entire world, which seemed as solid as the bathstone it was built from, came apart in the space of a single lifetime. Why does the gap matter so much? Because the audience that fell in love with this house is, above all, an American one, primed by Downton Abbey and by the Gilded Age to adore precisely this world, the great family and the servants who wait upon them. They came to the story with real affection and real curiosity, and they deserve the real thing, not only the sweetened version. The true Highclere does not diminish the beautiful one on screen. It deepens it. Behind every gliding figure in silk, there stood 3 or 4 others in plain dress who made the gliding possible, and their story is the harder, and in the end, the more human one. And it is a story the house itself tried to erase. The records of the great families fill libraries. The records of their servants are thin, scattered, often nameless, because the whole purpose of a servant was to leave no mark. We know the earls of Carnarvon in enormous detail. We know the maid who lit the fire at 5 in the morning barely at all. This film is an attempt to lean against that silence, to put the hidden house back into the story of the famous one, and to ask the question the tour never asks. Not who owned this beautiful place, but who actually kept it alive. The people who loved the television version came for the beauty of the upstairs world. What they never saw was the true cost of it, and who paid. That is where we are going. Down the back stairs, through the green baize door, into the real house behind the famous face. Chapter 2. A castle built to hide half of itself. The man who designed this house also designed the seat of British government, and he built Highclere with a secret folded into its walls. His name was Sir Charles Barry, and at the very moment he was reshaping this Hampshire house, he was also at work on the most famous building in London, the new Houses of Parliament, rising beside the Thames after the old ones had burned. Barry was the great architect of Victorian confidence, and when the 3rd Earl of Carnarvon asked him to transform an old Georgian mansion into something grander, Barry gave him the towered, turreted silhouette the world now knows. The work ran across the 1840s. Barry cased the older house in warm Bath stone, the honey-coloured stone that gives the walls their glow, and he raised a great central tower over the Hampshire trees. He called the style Anglo-Italian. Later writers usually call it Jacobean, a Victorian revival of the old Tudor and Jacobean manner, all vertical lines and carved stone and strapwork. It was a house designed to be looked at, to announce from a distance that here lived a family of the first rank. But a house of the first rank had a second job, and it was the opposite of announcement. It had to conceal. Because the grand life the front of the house promised could only be delivered by a hidden world of work, and that world of work could not be allowed to spoil the view. So Barry, and the architects who came after him, built Highclere as 2 houses in one shell. There was the house the guests saw, the great hall rising the full height of the building, the saloon, the library, with its more than 5,500 books, the drawing rooms and the dining room and the grand bedrooms above. And then, folded around and beneath and behind all of that, there was the other house, the service wing to the west, the basement world of kitchens and sculleries and larders and storerooms, the attic floors where the lower servants slept, and running between the two, like the nerves of a single body, a system of backstairs and narrow corridors along which the work of the house could move unseen. It is telling that the 2 houses were not even finished at the same time. The grand exterior, the part the world would admire, was largely complete before the 3rd Earl died in 1849. But the interiors and the west wing, the working half, the servants' half, dragged on for decades, and were not truly finished until the 1870s under the 4th Earl, with the architect Thomas Allen. The part that showed came first. The part that laboured came last. The house told you its priorities in the very order it was built. At the border between the two worlds hung a door. It was an ordinary door in most respects, but it was covered on the servants' side in green cloth, green baize, a heavy felt that deadened sound. This was the green baize door, and every great house of the age had one or more of them. On one side lay carpet and paint and gilt, the family's world. On the other lay bare boards and whitewash, and the smell of cooking and coal, the servants' world. The door was a seam sewn through the middle of the building, and its whole purpose was to keep the two halves from ever bleeding into one another. Sound did not cross it. Smell did not cross it. And people crossed it only in one direction, and only when their work required it. To summon that work, the house was wired like a nervous system. In the basement hung a board of bells, 66 of them, each one connected by a run of wire to a particular room. When a member of the family pulled a handle upstairs, a bell jangled below, and a servant read the board to see which room had called and hurried up the back stairs to answer it. 66 bells. 66 points at which the family could reach into the hidden house and pull a human being toward them without ever raising their voice, without ever crossing the green baize door themselves. There had been grandeur on this hill long before Barry arrived. A medieval palace of the bishops of Winchester had once stood here, and after that, a house called Place House, rebuilt in the 1670s by an ancestor of the family, Sir Robert Sawyer. In the following century, the grounds were shaped by the most famous landscape gardener in England, Lancelot Brown, the man known to all as Capability Brown. So the setting Barry inherited was already among the finest in the country, and the house he raised upon it was meant to crown a view that had been perfected across 100 years. The family who lived there were serious people as well as grand ones. The fourth Earl, who finished the interiors, was a statesman of real weight, and it was partly at Highclere in 1867 that he helped to draft the law that joined the provinces of British North America into the Dominion of Canada. So the house was not only a stage for shooting parties, it was a place where the business of an empire was sometimes done. But whether the work of a given day was affairs of state or a weekend's sport, the same truth held. All of it rested on the hidden half of the building, the service wing and the basement and the attics, and on the people who moved through them unseen. Stand in front of Highclere today, and you see one house, serene and whole. But it was always two, a house to be seen, and a house to do the seeing house's work, pressed together and held apart by a green cloth door. The genius of the design was that a guest could spend a week under that roof and never once glimpse the machinery that kept him warm and fed. The people who ran that machinery are who we meet next, starting with the man at the very top of the hidden house, the man the television series has taught the world to forget. Chapter 3. The bankrupt Earl and the banker's daughter. The family whose name was carved above the door could not, on its own income, afford to keep the door open. This is the first hard fact of the real Highclere, and it undoes the fantasy before we have even gone below stairs. The Earls of Carnarvon were grand. They were ancient. They owned thousands of acres of Hampshire and drew rents from farms across the estate. And by the end of the 19th century, they were, in plain terms, running out of money. The man at the centre of it was George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, born in 1866 and master of Highclere from 1890. He was clever, restless, and delicate in health, a collector and a wanderer, the sort of aristocrat who was happiest with a project and worst with a bank statement. And the bank statement was grim. By the time he came to marry, The figure most often attached to his debts was £150,000. In the money of the 1890s, that was not a shortfall. It was a fortune owed, a sum that in that age represented real wealth in its own right. He was not uniquely careless. He was caught in something far larger than himself. From the 1870s onward, British farming had fallen into a long depression, and the rents that had supported the landed families for centuries began to shrink. The land, which was supposed to pay for the great house, no longer paid enough. All across aristocratic England, families with famous names and enormous houses found themselves genuinely short of cash. Highclere was one of many. There was, in that age, one well-worn cure for an old title with empty coffers, and its name was marriage. New money married old rank. The bride brought a fortune, the groom brought a coronet, and both sides went home satisfied. Often the new money was American, the daughters of great American fortunes sent across the Atlantic to buy their way into the British aristocracy. Highclere's rescue followed exactly this pattern, but its source was closer to home and, if anything, richer still. In 1895, on the 26th of June, his own birthday, the 5th Earl married a young woman named Almina Wombwell. She was 19 years old, small and lovely, and known in society by the nickname the Pocket Venus. On paper, she was the daughter of a man named Frederick Wombwell. In truth, and everyone who mattered knew it, she was the illegitimate daughter of Alfred de Rothschild, of the great banking dynasty, one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Alfred had no legitimate children of his own, and he doted on Almina without limit. What Alfred de Rothschild did for his daughter's marriage is the reason this house still stands. He paid off the Earl's debts, the whole £150,000 of them, clearing the slate before the wedding. He settled on the couple a sum reported at £500,000, a figure worth something in the region of £73 million in today's money. And on top of that capital, he gave Almina an income for life, an annuity reported at £12,000 a year, arriving as reliably as the seasons. When Alfred died, years later, he left her £50,000 more in cash and a house in the most fashionable quarter of London. It is worth seeing just how common the Earl's predicament was, because it explains the whole marriage market of the age. Across aristocratic England, families with ancient names found their farm rents falling and their expenses climbing, and they looked about for fortunes to marry. Many of those fortunes came from America, the daughters of great new American fortunes sent across the Atlantic with enormous dowries to trade new money for old rank. Almina was not American, but the logic that placed her at Highclere was exactly the same. An old title in need of cash, and a vast new fortune in need of rank, and the Rothschild money did not stop at the wedding. When Alfred de Rothschild died in 1918, he left Almina a further £50,000 in cash outright, along with his house in the fashionable Mayfair quarter of London, and he left £25,000 each to the Earl and to the couple's 2 children. Year after year, in life and in death, the banker's fortune flowed into the Carnarvon family and the house it could not otherwise have kept. Think about what that money did. It did not simply pay off a debt. It refloated an entire way of life. It paid the wages of the hidden household we are about to meet, the dozens of indoor servants and the many more across the estate. It paid for the shooting parties and the London season. It would, in time, pay for one of the most famous adventures of the age, a search for a lost king beneath the sands of Egypt. Every candle in every silver stick at Highclere, in a real sense, was lit with Rothschild money. And here is the quiet cruelty at the heart of the arrangement. The grandeur that the world admired, The effortless ease of the Carnarvons in their beautiful rooms was not the family's own achievement at all. It was borrowed. It rested on a banker's fortune above stairs and on an army of underpaid servants below. The family supplied the name and the title. Everyone else supplied the means. With the debts cleared and the Rothschild money flowing, the house could at last perform at its full height. To make that performance happen, night after night, somebody had to actually run the place, and it was not the Earl. Chapter 4. The Man Who Really Ran the Castle. The most powerful person inside Highclere was not the Earl, and it was not the Countess, and the television series will never tell you his name. Ask anyone who has watched Downton Abbey who is in charge below stairs, and they will answer at once. The butler. The grave, dignified man in black who stands at the head of the servants' table and rules the household with a raised eyebrow. It is a wonderful character. It is also, at a house of Highclere's true rank, a demotion. Because above the butler stood another man, and it was he who really ran the place. His title was House Steward, and at Highclere in this era, his name was Streatfield. The butler, for all his dignity, answered to him. The house steward was less like a head servant and more like the managing director of a business, and the business was the running of a great house. He ordered the supplies. He kept the accounts, page after page of them, every candle and every side of beef and every bottle from the cellar written down. He hired and disciplined the lower staff. He held the whole vast operation in his head and his ledgers, and he did it year after year, while above stairs the family came and went. There was a saying in these households that caught the truth of it exactly. Countesses come and countesses go, but a good house steward stays for life. The family were the owners, but they were also, in a sense, passing through. They inherited, they married, they died, they were replaced. The steward endured. He knew where every key was kept, and every account stood, and every bottle of wine lay in the dark of the cellar. Without him, the machine simply stopped. With him, it ran so smoothly that the family upstairs could forget it was a machine at all. Beneath the steward, the male side of the household spread out in a strict order of rank. There was the groom of the chambers, who saw to the reception rooms and the needs of guests. There was the butler, and beneath him, the under-butler. There were the valets, the personal gentleman's servants, who dressed and shaved and attended the master and his male guests. And then came the footmen, at least 4 of them, the tall young men in livery, who carried and served and lent the house its air of effortless plenty. Below them again were the porters and the steward's room boy, the youngest and lowest of all, who fetched and carried for his betters and dreamed of one day rising. The female half of the house was a mirror of the male half, and it answered to a different head entirely. At its summit stood the housekeeper, a woman of enormous authority in her own domain, her ring of keys hanging at her waist as the visible sign of her power. She commanded a household of women that roughly matched the men in number, the ladies' maids who dressed the countess and her daughters, the head housemaid and the housemaids under her, who cleaned and dusted and made the fires and turned the beds, the still room maids who made the preserves and the cakes and the morning coffee, the laundry maids who fought an endless war with the linen of a house that changed its sheets and its shirts without a thought, and at the very bottom, the kitchen maids and the scullery maids whose hands were never dry and whose work was never done. 2 hierarchies then, one of men and one of women, each with its own head, each with its own strict ladder of rank, meeting only at the very top where the steward and the housekeeper conferred. Below stairs at Highclere was not a cosy corridor. It was a small and rigidly ordered society, with its own government, its own laws, and its own unbending sense of place. The number of indoor servants under the steward alone ran to something like 18 men. and the housekeeper's side matched them, so that the family of a handful of people was attended, inside the house alone, by dozens. Outside, across the stables and the gardens and the home farm, there were dozens more. The steward's power was written in his ledgers. Every great house ran on an enormous and constant flow of supply, food and drink and coal and candles and cloth and countless small necessities, and all of it had to be ordered, received, recorded, and paid for. That was the steward's kingdom. He dealt with the tradesmen. He kept the household accounts in which the cost of the family's life was set down in careful columns. He knew, better than the earl ever did, exactly what it cost to be a Carnarvon for a single week. In an age of cash and ledgers, the man who held the accounts held a quiet and enormous authority. There were rewards for those who rose within this world. A servant who gave long and faithful service might climb, over decades, from the very bottom of the ladder toward its top, and loyalty was answered with promotion when a place fell vacant. Married servants were given cottages on the estate, tying their whole family to its fortunes. Board wages, a cash allowance for food when the family was away and the kitchens were quiet, were part of the pay. It was a career, of a kind, with a ladder to climb and real security at the top. And for those who reached the senior ranks, it carried genuine dignity. But the ladder was steep, the bottom rungs were brutal, and most who stood on them would never climb very far, and every one of them knew precisely where they stood. A footman did not speak to a maid as an equal if he outranked her. A scullery maid did not address the housekeeper unless spoken to first. The order of precedence that ruled the family upstairs, the careful business of who outranked whom, was mirrored below stairs with just as much iron. The servants had absorbed the very system that kept them at the bottom, and they enforced it upon each other. That was the quiet genius of the arrangement. The house did not need to police the servants. The servants policed themselves. At the head of it all stood Streatfield, the man whose name the world has forgotten in favor of a fictional butler. He is the key to the whole story, because he is the proof of the argument this film is making. The real power in a great house did not lie with the family whose name it bore. It lay with the servant who actually knew how the place worked, and what that place demanded of the people below him, hour by hour, from the first cold grate before dawn, is where we go next. Chapter 5. The morning began in the dark. Long before the family stirred, a young woman was already on her knees in a cold grate, and her day had started hours earlier than theirs. She was a housemaid, one of the lowest ranks in the house, and the fire was her enemy and her duty both. In an age before central heating, a great house was warmed by coal fires, dozens of them, one in every room that mattered, and every single one had to be cleaned out, laid fresh, and lit. That work could not happen while the family were awake to see it. So it happened in the dark. She rose while the sky was still black. In a bare attic room she shared with other maids, dressed in the cold, and crept down the back stairs with her box of brushes and blacking. In each room she raked out yesterday's ashes, swept the hearth, blacked the grate until it shone, laid the new fire, and lit it, so that by the time the family opened their eyes, the room was already warm and clean, and there was no trace of the hands that had made it so. She did this room after room, fire after fire, on her knees on cold floors, her own breath showing in the air. The warmth the family woke to was made of her early rising and her raw hands, and it was made invisibly, which was the entire point. This was the shape of the servants' day, and it was long past anything a modern worker would recognize. The lowest servants were up before dawn. The last of them did not climb to bed until the family had finally retired and the fires were banked and the doors were locked and the last candle was carried up the back stairs. In between lay a working day of many long hours, broken only by snatched meals and whatever brief rest the house allowed. The body paid for this. Feet swelled, backs bent, hands cracked and bled in winter. And the wages, by any honest measure, were small, with their board and their attic bed thrown in. Yet the servants below stairs did not eat together as equals, because even hunger had a hierarchy. The upper servants, the steward and the housekeeper, and the valets and the ladies' maids, dined apart, often in the steward's room, and were waited on there by the lower ranks. The lower servants ate in the servants' hall, plainer food in a plainer room. In some houses, the upper servants would take the first part of a meal in the hall and then rise and process out to the steward's room for the rest, leaving the lower servants behind. The distinctions of the world upstairs were reproduced, in miniature, at the servants' own table. There was an upstairs to the downstairs. There was a below stairs to the below stairs. What held this hard life together, and made people not only endure it, but stay, was a strange and real kind of belonging. Many of the servants at Highclere came from families that had served the Carnarvons for generations. A father in the stables, a daughter in the still room, a son as a hall boy hoping to rise to footman. The estate provided cottages for its married servants, tied to their work, and a place in the household could pass down a family like an inheritance. People gave 40 years and more to a single house. There is loyalty in that, and pride, and it would be a lie to paint every servant as a prisoner. Many loved the house they served, and took real pride in its shine. But the belonging was built on an inequality so complete that it was written into the very hours of the day. The maid on her knees in the dark and the family asleep in the warm bed were bound together, yes. They were part of one household, one community, one long story of the same acres. And they were also as far apart as two human beings under one roof could be. One life existed to produce comfort, the other existed to consume it. The green baize door ran between them, and it did not open both ways. After the fires came the rest of the day, and it did not slacken. The housemaids moved on from the grates to the sweeping and dusting and airing of room after room, all of it to be finished in the parts of the house the family used before the family appeared to use them. The still room maids were already at work on the morning coffee and the bread and the preserves. In the laundry, the maids faced the endless mountain of linen that a great house produced, the sheets and shirts and tablecloths and towels of a household that changed its cloth without a thought for the labour of washing it. Water had to be heated. Whites had to be boiled and starched and pressed with heavy flat irons warmed at the fire, and the work went on all week. And for all of this, the pay was slight. Their food and their shared attic bed counted as part of the bargain. The great fortune that flowed through the house from the Rothschild bank, the £500,000 of settlement, the £12,000 a year of income, touched these women barely at all. They produced the comfort. They did not share in the wealth. The distance between the annuity upstairs and the wage below stairs was the distance between two entirely different lives, lived under one roof, divided by a door covered in green cloth. Consider the plain arithmetic of it. A single family, 2 adults and their children, kept in warmth and cleanliness and plenty by an indoor staff of dozens, supported in turn by an outdoor staff of dozens more, all of it paid for by a fortune from outside. 66 bells to call them. At least 4 tall footmen to serve one dinner. Housemaids on their knees before dawn so that a room might be warm by the time the family woke. This was extravagance of a permanent and structural kind, not the wildness of a single night, but the steady daily cost of a way of life, an entire economy of human beings arranged around the comfort of a few. And to keep those few from ever having to see how it was done, the house had a second set of rules, stranger than the hours about who was allowed to be seen at all. Chapter 6. The Rules of Being Invisible. A maid who met a member of the family in a corridor was expected to stop, turn to the wall, and make herself into furniture. This was not a joke, and it was not an exaggeration. In the great houses of the age, there were real rules, some written and many simply understood, about the servants remaining unseen. The ideal servant was one whose work was everywhere visible, and whose person was invisible. The fires were lit, the rooms were clean, the meals appeared, and yet the family were spared the sight of the labor that produced any of it. To achieve that, the human beings doing the work had, as far as possible, to disappear. This is why the back stairs existed. A great house like Highclere had two entirely separate systems of movement. There were the grand stairs and the grand corridors, wide and carpeted and hung with pictures, for the family and their guests. And there were the back stairs, narrow and bare and often dark, threading up through the house from the basement to the attics, for the servants. A footman carrying a coal scuttle or a maid carrying a chamber pot did not pass through the family's world to do it. He or she moved through the hidden veins of the house, up and down the back stairs, along the service corridors, and emerged into a grand room only to perform a task and then vanish again. And when the two worlds did accidentally meet, the rule was clear, and it fell entirely on the servant. The servant yielded. The servant looked away. In many households, the lower servants were instructed that if they encountered the family unexpectedly, they should stand still and turn their faces to the wall until the family had passed, as though they were not there at all. The message could hardly be plainer. Your presence is a flaw in the machine. When you are seen, the illusion cracks, so do not be seen. Nowhere was the strangeness of all this clearer than in the footmen. The footmen were the servants the family and their guests saw most because their whole function was display. They carried the dishes, they waited at table, they opened the doors, they rode on the carriages. And so, uniquely among the staff, they were chosen partly for how they looked. A footman was hired in part for his height. Tall men were prized, and a pair of tall footmen, matched in height like a matched pair of carriage horses, was a mark of a rich and serious household. A taller footman could command a higher wage than a shorter one, for no reason other than the inches he stood. His body was part of the furniture of the house, and it was priced accordingly. Then there was the hair. Into the 20th century, footmen at grand houses powdered their hair to wait at dinner, coating it in a white paste and powder in the fashion of a vanished century. It was uncomfortable, and it was laborious, and it was faintly absurd, a piece of living theatre performed every evening behind the dining chairs. At Highclere, as at other great houses, the powdered footman survived right up until the years of the First World War, until about 1918, when the young men who had performed it were swept away into the trenches and the whole tradition died with the world that had demanded it. But for the length of the era we are inside, there they stood, tall and powdered and silent, human ornaments in livery, part of the effect the house existed to produce. The green baize door governed all of this. It was the border, and the rules of invisibility were the border's law. On the family's side, comfort and ease, and the appearance of a world that ran itself. On the servant's side, the labour and the hurry and the whispered orders that actually ran it. The door kept the sound out and the smell out, and above all, kept the people out, except when they were needed, and even then, it kept them silent and quick and self-effacing. A servant who understood the house understood the door, and understood that his job was to pass through it without leaving a ripple. The demand for invisibility shaped even where a servant might walk in the open air. In many great houses, the servants had their own paths and their own entrances, so that they might come and go about their work without crossing the lawns and gravel where the family took the air. The whole estate, indoors and out, was quietly divided into the seen and the unseen, the front and the back, and every servant learned by heart which was which. To be caught on the wrong side, in the wrong place, at the wrong moment, was a fault, and the fault was always the servant's. There is a strange economy in the way the house valued its people, and the footman shows it most sharply. He was paid for his inches and his looks, because he was, in a real sense, on display, a piece of the household's grandeur made flesh. A short man, however able, could not be a first footman at a great house. A tall, handsome pair, matched like ornaments, were worth more in wages precisely because they were worth more as a spectacle. The body itself was priced, and on top of the height and the livery came the powder, the white paste worked into the hair for dinner, uncomfortable and slow to apply, and gloriously pointless, a costume from a lost century worn night after night, so that a family might dine inside a living picture of their own importance. There is something genuinely eerie in it when you stand back and look. An entire class of people, in the prime of their lives, trained to move through a house like ghosts, to be present and absent at once, to produce warmth and food and light, and then dissolve back into the walls. They were not slaves. They were paid, and they could in principle leave, and many rose and prospered. But within the house they inhabited a kind of enforced invisibility that shaped their bodies and their movements, and even where they were allowed to look. The house was a machine for making labour disappear, and the servants were the moving parts trained never to show. And nowhere did that machine strain harder, or hide more, than on the great nights when the house filled with guests, and every hidden part of it was driven to its limit. Chapter 7. Dinner was a machine. When a shooting party arrived, dozens of guests and their servants descended at once, and below stairs it was less a dinner than a controlled emergency. This was the house at its full and famous height, the Edwardian country house party, the very thing the television series loves to show. Carriages and, later, motor cars sweeping up the drive, trunks carried up, ladies in silk and gentlemen in tweed. Days of shooting across the estate, elaborate luncheons carried out to the guns, and in the evening, a dinner of many courses served in a blaze of candlelight and silver. Upstairs it looked like magic. Downstairs it was war. Consider what a single great dinner actually demanded. In the kitchen, a cook and a brigade of assistants had been at work for the best part of the day and would work deep into the night. There might be many courses, each with its own dishes, each requiring its own preparation, its own timing, its own sauces and garnishes, all of it to arrive at the table hot and perfect and in the right order. The kitchen at a house like Highclere sat well away from the dining room, down corridors and through doors, so that the smell and the heat and the noise of cooking never reached the family. Which meant that every dish had to travel, carried by footmen at a near run, from a kitchen that might be many yards and several doors away, and still arrive hot. The distance that protected the family's noses was paid for in the legs of the servants. Around the table stood the footmen, tall and powdered, one behind the chairs for every few guests, moving in a silent choreography of serving and clearing that had to be flawless. In the background, the underservants ferried dishes to and from the kitchen. In the still room, coffee and sweets were prepared. In the cellars, the butler or the steward had already chosen and decanted the wines. Upstairs, The guests experienced a smooth and endless flow of food and drink, appearing and vanishing as if the house simply exhaled it. Not one of them saw the sweating kitchen, the shouted orders, the maid scalding her hands at the sink, the footman gulping air between courses. That was the arrangement. The calm above was manufactured by the storm below, and a house party was not one dinner. It was days of them, and days of breakfasts and luncheons and teas. Besides, for a house suddenly full not only of guests, but of the guests' own servants, who arrived with them and had to be housed and fed below stairs too. A visiting lady brought her lady's maid. A visiting gentleman brought his valet. These upper visiting servants had their own precedence in the steward's room, seated by the rank of the master or mistress they served, so that the snobbery of the drawing-room was replayed, exactly, among the servants who dressed its occupants. The household's own staff, already stretched, now cooked and cleaned and carried for double the number. The laundry alone, for a house full of guests changing their clothes several times a day, was a punishing and unending labour. Over all of this, from time to time, fell the ultimate pressure. The presence of royalty. The future King Edward VII, then the Prince of Wales, moved through exactly this world of country house parties and shooting weeks. A royal guest turned an already enormous effort into something close to a state occasion. Nothing could be less than perfect. The best rooms, the best food, the best of everything the house could produce, delivered under the eye of a court. For the servants, it meant days and nights of labour pitched at the very edge of what was possible, so that for a handful of hours, a prince might feel himself perfectly, effortlessly at ease. The visiting servants deserve a moment of their own, because they reveal how completely the snobbery of the drawing-room ran through the whole house. When a grand party arrived, the guests' valets and ladies' maids did not simply join the Highclere staff as equals. They took their place in the servants' order by the rank of the master or mistress they served, so that at the steward's table, the servant of the grandest guest sat highest, and the others below, in exact and unspoken order. A lady's maid was known below stairs by her mistress's name. The whole delicate machinery of who outranked whom, which governed the seating of the dinner upstairs, was reproduced, course by course, among the people who had dressed the diners. Now hold the full picture in your mind for a moment. Above the green baize door, a shooting party at its ease, the guns returning at dusk, the fires lit, the bath water carried up, the dressing gongs sounding, the family and their guests descending to a dinner that seemed to cost no one any effort at all. Below the door, in the same hours, a kitchen at the very edge of chaos, footmen half running the length of cold corridors with covered dishes, maids scrubbing the pans of one course while the next went up, the laundry steaming, the still room busy, the whole hidden house pushed to its limit. Two worlds, one roof, one dinner, and only a door covered in green cloth between the calm and the storm. Here is the scale of the thing, laid bare. One family, a house of some 300 rooms, a library of more than 5,500 books, 66 bells to summon the staff, an indoor household of dozens and an outdoor one of dozens more, at least 4 powdered footmen behind the chairs at a single dinner, and a kitchen labouring through the night to fill those chairs' plates. And behind every visible servant, another layer of unseen ones, in the scullery, the larder, the laundry, the cellar, the coal store, all of it moving at once, all of it hidden, all of it aimed at a single target. The appearance of ease. This was the house at its peak, the moment the whole machine ran at full power, and the effect it produced was at its most dazzling. It looked eternal. It looked like the natural order of the world, the great family in its great house, served as families like it had always been served. But it was not the natural order of anything. It was a performance held up by borrowed money and cheap labour, and both of those supports were about to be pulled away. The first crack would not come from the fields of England or the account books of the estate. It would come from a hole in the ground, thousands of miles away, beneath the sand of the Valley of the Kings. Chapter 8. The Gold That Came from a Tomb. While the household strained to keep the house alive, its master poured the family fortune into a hole in the Egyptian sand. The 5th Earl of Carnarvon had a passion, and it was not his estate. It was Egypt. His health had never been strong, and it grew worse after a serious motor accident in Germany in 1903, a crash that left him fragile for the rest of his life, and, some say, first sent him to the warm, dry air of Egypt to recover. Whatever drew him there, once it had him, it did not let go. He fell utterly in love with the buried past of the Nile. Egyptology in that age was an expensive hobby for rich men, and the Earl threw himself into it. He obtained the right to dig, and he needed an expert to do the digging, and so he joined his money to the skill of a brilliant and dedicated archaeologist named Howard Carter. It was a partnership of opposites, the aristocrat with the fortune and the fascination, and the working archaeologist with the knowledge and the obsessive patience. Together, from around 1907 onward, they searched. For years, they found little of great note. Digging in the Valley of the Kings was slow, hot, costly work, clearing tons of sand and rubble in the hope of a doorway that might not be there. The First World War interrupted the search entirely. When it resumed, the Earl was funding season after season with less and less to show, and it is said he had nearly decided to give the whole thing up. Carter begged for one more season. The Earl, to his lasting fame, agreed to pay for it. And in November of 1922, Carter's men uncovered a step cut into the rock, and then another, and then a sealed doorway, and behind it, the almost untouched tomb of a boy king who had lain undisturbed for more than 3,000 years. Tutankhamun. The discovery was, and remains, one of the most famous in the history of the world. The tomb was crammed with treasure, gold and alabaster and painted wood, an entire royal burial, preserved as almost no other had been. The Earl and Carter had found the thing every Egyptologist dreamed of, and none had ever quite grasped. For a moment, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon stood at the very summit of fame, the aristocrat who had paid for the discovery of the age. It had cost him a great deal of his fortune, the Rothschild fortune that also kept his house running, spent across years on racehorses and fast cars, and above all, on the long gamble of the sand. And now, at last, it had paid. To grasp the scale of the gamble, picture the years of it. Season after season, the Earl paid for teams of Egyptian workers to clear the Valley of the Kings under the fierce sun, shifting mountains of sand and rubble in the hope of a step, a seal, a door. Most seasons ended with little to show. The costs mounted into a small fortune, all of it drawn in the end from the family's Rothschild-backed wealth. And after years of it, even the Earl's patience and his purse were running thin. The tomb of Tutankhamun was very nearly never found, because its patron very nearly stopped paying. "One more season," Carter pleaded. "One more," the Earl agreed. It was one of the most consequential yes answers in the history of discovery. And there was a strange coda to the money as well. The treasures of the tomb did not enrich the family, whatever the rumours said. Under the arrangements that governed the find, the great hoard belonged to Egypt. After the Earl's death, the Egyptian authorities effectively settled with his family for the work and the expenses, paying something in the region of £35,000, a sum worth something in the region of £2.5 million in today's money, for what had been spent in the finding. The man who had poured a fortune into the sand did not draw a fortune back out of it. He got the fame, and the tomb, and then the grave, and then, within months, he was dead. In the spring of 1923, in a hotel in Cairo, the earl cut a mosquito bite while shaving. The wound became infected. Blood poisoning set in, and then pneumonia, in a body already weakened by the crash of 20 years before, and on the 5th of April 1923, he died, only a few months after the greatest triumph of his life. The world, thrilled and horrified in equal measure, reached at once for a darker explanation: the curse of the pharaohs. The idea took hold immediately that the men who disturbed the boy king's rest had been struck down by an ancient vengeance, and the earl's sudden death seemed to prove it. Newspapers ran the story around the globe. It has never entirely died. And here it is, worth being honest and careful at once, because a good story deserves the truth beside it. There is no evidence of any curse. The documented cause of the earl's death is an infected insect bite that led to blood poisoning and pneumonia in a man whose health had been broken for 2 decades. That is the grounded explanation, and it is almost certainly the whole of it. And yet the timing was so strange, the fall from triumph to grave so swift, that the eerie feeling has never quite lifted. The facts are plain. The chill remains. Both can be true at once. What the curse story hid, in all its noise, was the quieter and more real crisis it left behind. The master of Highclere was dead. The fortune he had spent so freely was diminished, and his death, like the death of any great landowner, brought down upon the estate a bill that the age had designed precisely to break houses like his. But before that reckoning arrived in full, the house would be transformed by another force entirely, and by the very woman whose money had held it up all along. Chapter 9. The Countess who turned the house into a hospital. When the war came, the woman whose fortune had saved the house turned its grand rooms into wards and became a nurse herself. Almina, the Countess of Carnarvon, the banker's daughter who had married a title and refloated a bankrupt estate, turned out to possess something the marriage had never asked of her: a genuine calling. When the First World War broke out in 1914 and the wounded began to come home from the fighting in France, she did not content herself with patronage from a distance. She opened the doors of Highclere itself. She converted the castle into a hospital for wounded officers. The grand bedrooms became sick rooms. The house that had been built to display wealth was turned to the business of mending broken men, and Almina did not merely lend her rooms and her name. She ran it. She hired the best surgeons she could find. She bought the newest equipment. She nursed the men herself, dressing wounds and sitting with the dying, pouring the Rothschild money that had bought her the house now into saving the lives of soldiers she had never met. Later, she moved the hospital to a large house in London, closer to the surgeons and the trains that brought the wounded, and ran it on the same lavish, uncompromising standard. There is a strange and moving inversion in this. For decades, the machinery of Highclere had existed to produce comfort for a handful of privileged people, and to hide the labour that produced it. Now, for a few years, that same machinery was turned toward mercy. The kitchens that had cooked for shooting parties cooked for convalescing officers. The maids who had laid fires for the family laid them for the wounded. The house steward's genius for supply and order, the housekeeper's command of linen and stores, all of it was bent to the running of a hospital. The hidden household did not vanish in the war. For a while, it was repurposed, its enormous capacity for labour aimed at something other than display. But the war that gave the house this brief and noble second life was also, in the same years, killing the world that had made the house possible in the first place. Because the men who filled the wards were the same class of men from top to bottom of society, who were being lost in vast numbers. And the great houses of England were sending their people to the front from both sides of the green baize door. The young heirs went as officers. The footmen and the hall boys and the grooms and the gardeners went as soldiers. Upstairs and downstairs marched off together, and together many of them did not come back. Picture the change that came over the rooms. Where there had been house parties and shooting weeks, there were now iron beds and the smell of antiseptic. Officers with shattered limbs and gassed lungs lay recovering in bedrooms hung with old portraits. The Countess in her nurse's apron moved among them, and the same staff who had served the shooting parties now carried trays to the wounded and changed the dressings and laid the fires in the sick rooms. Almina spared no expense, because sparing expense had never been the family's habit, and because for once the money was going to something beyond display. She bought the finest surgical equipment. She brought in surgeons of the first rank. She ran her hospital as she had run her house, on the principle that only the best would do. And all the while, the war was hollowing out the very household that made the hospital possible. The footmen and the grooms and the hall boys who had not yet gone were going. Every month, the great houses of England sent more of their young men into the army, and every month the casualty lists came back longer. The women below stairs took on more as the men vanished. It was a strange and terrible reversal. The house that had been a monument to leisure had become a place of healing, staffed by a workforce that was itself bleeding away into the same war that filled its beds. For Almina personally, the war years were her finest hour, the moment her money and her energy and her need to be useful all found their purpose at once. She was, by every account, a formidable and tireless matron, and the men she nursed had reason to bless the day the pocket Venus turned her castle into a hospital. It is one of the genuinely admirable chapters in the whole story of the house, and it should be told as such. The borrowed fortune, for these few years, went to the saving of lives. There is a detail in it that lingers. The men who came to Highclere to be healed were, many of them, young officers of exactly the class the house had always served. And yet they arrived broken in a way no shooting weekend had ever left a guest. They were carried up the same grand stairs that had welcomed dukes. They convalesced in rooms built for pleasure. And they were nursed by a countess who had bought her way into that world with a banker's money and now spent it, without stint, on their recovery. For a few years, the house stopped pretending. It was no longer a stage for the appearance of ease. It was a place where the real costs of the age, the shattered bodies of its young men, were laid plainly in its finest beds. It says a great deal about Almina that this, and not the balls and the seasons, was the work she threw herself into with her whole heart. The marriage had been arranged around money and rank. It had not asked her to be anything but decorative. And when the moment came, she turned out to be tireless, exacting, and genuinely good at the hardest kind of work, the daily care of the dying and the maimed. The pocket Venus of the society pages became, in the war, a formidable matron whom wounded men had cause to bless. And yet even here the shadow was gathering. The hospital was a thing of the war, and the war would end. And when it ended, the world would not go back to what it had been. The supply of cheap, deferential servants that had staffed Highclere for generations was being cut down in the trenches and would never fully recover. The powdered footman, that living relic of an older century, was serving his last dinners. The great machine of the country house had been paused, turned to mercy, and admired for it. But it could not simply start up again, unchanged, when peace came. Too many of its parts were gone, and waiting for the family, the moment the guns fell silent and the master died, was a tax deliberately built to finish the job. Chapter 10. The tax built to break them. In 1894, the government designed a tax with a single, quiet purpose: to break exactly this kind of fortune, one death at a time. It was called estate duty, though the world would come to know it by a blunter and truer name: death duties. And to understand why it mattered so much, an American viewer needs only to grasp what kind of wealth it was aimed at, and how that wealth was held. The fortunes of the old British aristocracy were not held in cash. They were held in land, and in the great house that sat upon it, and in the pictures and silver and libraries inside. A family like the Carnarvons might look immensely rich, and yet have very little money, because their wealth was locked up in acres and stone. It produced an income in rents. But that income was already shrinking under the long agricultural depression, and much of it was already spoken for. This was wealth that was grand and illiquid, and, crucially, concentrated in a single inheritance passed whole from one heir to the next. Death duties struck at exactly that. Every time the owner of such an estate died, the state now took a share of the value of the whole and demanded it in money. But the family did not have money. Their wealth was in the land and the house. So to pay the tax, they had to sell something: a farm, a painting, a stretch of the estate, a treasure from the collection. And then the next owner died, and the tax fell again, and another piece was sold to meet it. Over 2 or 3 generations, a fortune that had stood for centuries could be quietly dismembered, sold off in pieces to the taxman, until the house at the centre of it stood stripped and unaffordable. The tax did not confiscate the estate in one blow. It bled it, death by death. There was a bitter logic to the timing of it all. The tax had been brought in during the 1890s, in the very decade when the old agricultural income was already failing, and families like the Carnarvons were already reaching for heiresses to stay afloat. So the state began taking its great bite from these fortunes at the exact moment the fortunes could least withstand it. A system that had taken centuries to build was now caught between falling income on one side and rising taxation on the other, and squeezed harder with every passing year. For the servants, all of this arrived as something they felt long before they understood it. The household budgets tightened. Posts left empty when a servant retired were not always filled. The talk in the servants' hall turned to which of the great houses nearby were closing rooms, or letting staff go, or shutting their doors for good. The people at the bottom of the stairs could read the health of a great house better than anyone, because they felt every economy in their own workload and their own numbers. And what they were reading, across these years, was the slow sickening of the whole world that employed them. Set this against everything else pressing on the great houses at the same time. The farm rents were falling and had been for decades. The cost of running a house like Highclere, the dozens of servants, the entertaining, the upkeep of hundreds of rooms, went on and on regardless. And the families kept spending on the life their rank seemed to demand. The racehorses, the motor cars, the seasons in London, the long, expensive gamble in the Egyptian sand. It was a machine that consumed money at a tremendous rate, while the money coming in shrank year by year, and the taxman took a great bite from every inheritance. The mathematics could only end one way. For an American ear, the word aristocracy can suggest simply money. But the reality was more particular and more fragile than that. A family like the Carnarvons was rich the way a museum is rich. Their wealth was the land itself, thousands of acres of it, and the great house, and the pictures and books and silver within. It was magnificent, and it was almost entirely unspendable. You cannot pay a tax bill with a wing of a mansion or with a stretch of capability brown parkland. To turn any of it into cash, you had to sell it. And once it was sold, it was gone from the family forever. That is what made the death duties so quietly lethal. The tax did not care that the family had little ready money. It fell on the value of the whole estate, and it fell every time the estate passed to a new heir, which in the ordinary run of things meant once a generation. So a family might be forced to sell a farm to bury one earl, and a great painting to bury the next, and a stretch of ancient land to bury the one after that, each death taking another bite until the estate that had stood whole for centuries was eaten down to a fraction of itself. It was, in effect, a slow and legal dismantling of exactly the kind of concentrated old wealth that houses like Highclere represented. And it worked. When the fifth Earl died in 1923, fresh from the fame of Tutankhamun, the death duties fell upon Highclere as they fell upon every such estate at every such death. The timing could hardly have been worse, coming as it did when so much of the Rothschild fortune had already been poured into Egypt, and the wider world of the great house was already reeling from the war. The estate had to find money it did not easily have, in the way all these estates now had to, by retrenching and selling and cutting back. This is the crucial thing to understand about the fall of the country house, and it is why this film keeps returning to numbers rather than to villains. There was no single catastrophe at Highclere, no fire, no scandal, no mad heir who gambled it away in a night. There was something slower and more certain than any of those. A structural impossibility. A way of life that cost more than it earned. Staffed by a workforce the war had thinned. Taxed by a state that had decided such fortunes should not pass intact. Sitting in a house that needed a fortune simply to keep the rain out. The wonder is not that so many of these houses fell. The wonder is that any of them survived at all. And the people who felt the impossibility first and hardest were not the family. They were the servants, whose entire world was about to disappear from under them. Chapter 11. The servants who never came home. The war did not only take the heirs from the great bedrooms upstairs, it emptied the attics and the backstairs as well. When the fighting began in 1914, the young men of Highclere went to it, and they went from both sides of the green baize door. The sons of the family went as officers, in the way their class had always gone to war. And the footmen, the hall boys, the undergardeners, the grooms and the stable lads, the young men of the servants' hall, went as soldiers. The house that had sorted them so carefully by rank sent them all to the same trenches. And the same trenches did not care about rank. The war killed the servant class of England on a scale that is hard to hold in the mind. The young men who had waited at table and lit the fires and carried the coal were, many of them, killed or maimed, or simply gone from service forever, having seen a wider and harder world than the servants' hall, and having no wish to return to a life of turning their faces to the wall. The deference that had made the whole system work, the quiet acceptance of one's place at the bottom of the stairs, did not survive what those men saw and did between 1914 and 1918. You can see the change in a single small detail, the powdered footman. That absurd and beautiful relic, the tall young man with his hair whitened in the fashion of a vanished century, standing silent behind the dining chairs, was a creature of the old world, and the old world ended in the war. By around 1918, the powdered footman was essentially finished at Highclere and everywhere else, because the young men who had performed the part were dead or gone, and the ones who remained would not be turned back into living ornaments. A whole theatre of service, centuries in the making, simply stopped, in the space of 4 years. The loss was strangely intimate, because these were not strangers to the family. A footman might have served at table for 10 years. A groom might have taught the young heir to ride. The gardeners and the keepers and the hallboys were known faces, woven into the daily life of the house. And when their names began to appear on the lists of the dead, the grief crossed the green baize door in a way almost nothing else ever did. The war did not respect the careful separation the house had spent a century building. It took the sons from the great bedrooms and the young men from the attics with the same indifference. For those who survived and came home, the house they returned to was changed past recognizing. Some came back to service and found they could no longer bear it, the smallness of it, the deference after the enormous and terrible equality of the trenches. Others never returned to it at all, and the places they had held stood empty. A young man who had been a footman in 1914 was, by the end of the war, a different creature entirely, and the livery and the powder and the turned face belonged to a world he had outgrown. The house wanted its old servants back. The old servants, the ones still living, had gone somewhere the house could not follow. What followed the war was not a sudden collapse, but a long, quiet emptying. The households that had run on dozens of cheap hands could no longer find them. The men were gone, and the ones who lived had other options now, in factories and offices and shops that paid better, and did not demand that a grown adult make himself invisible. Wages for the servants who remained had to rise, and the numbers who could be afforded fell, and the great houses that had been built to be run by armies found themselves trying to manage with a handful. The vast, ordered, invisible population that this whole film has been describing, the two hierarchies under the steward and the housekeeper, the tall footmen and the still room maids and the boys who dreamed of rising, began to thin away and did not stop. Think of what was actually lost below stairs in those years. Not only lives, though the lives were the worst of it. A world, a way of living, with its own laws and its own strange belonging, its own ladder that a hallboy might climb over 40 years to become a steward, its own families rooted in the same acres for generations. It had been a hard world and an unjust one, built on invisibility and long hours and small wages. But it had been a world, and it had been the world of a very large number of people, and it was ending. Every great house that shrank its staff or shut its doors scattered a community that had taken generations to grow. And with the people went the knowledge. A house like Highclere had run on skills passed down within families and within the servants' hall over generations, the exact way a particular fire was laid, a particular silver polished, a particular room aired, the whole unwritten craft of keeping a great house alive. When the young men died in France, and the young women left for better work, and the old servants retired with no one trained to replace them, that craft began to vanish too. It was not only bodies that the war and the years took from below stairs. It was a whole living tradition, centuries deep, and once broken, it could not be reassembled. The household did not only lose its people, it lost the knowledge of how a great house was run at all. At Highclere, the machine that had produced all that effortless Edwardian grandeur was, by the 1920s, running down. The master was dead, and the death duties had come. The fortune had been spent in the sand. The servants who had made the whole performance possible were vanishing, killed in France or gone to better work, and could not be replaced. The house still stood, as beautiful as ever from the drive, but the hidden world that had given it life was slipping away, room by room, post by post, and no marriage and no fortune could ever bring that world back. What remained was a great and famous shell, growing colder and emptier by the year, waiting to see whether anything at all could save it. Chapter 12. The Slow Death by Leaking Roof. There was no wrecking ball for Highclere, only something quieter and almost sadder, a great house dying of its own upkeep. This is where the honest story parts company with the dramatic one. Across the middle of the 20th century, hundreds of England's great houses met spectacular ends. They were demolished outright, blown up, pulled down, their stones sold, their parks dug for coal, at a rate that in the worst years reached something close to one great house lost every few days. Highclere was not one of those. Its fate was slower, and in its way more melancholy. It simply began, year by year, to fall down of its own weight. First, the fortune that had held it up departed. Almina, the source of all the money, did not linger long as the widowed countess. She remarried within the year of the fifth earl's death, and the great Rothschild fortune that had refloated the estate and paid its wages and funded its dreams went with her. The woman who had turned the castle into a hospital and nursed its wounded ended her own life, far from any castle at all. She died in 1969, in a hospital in the city of Bristol, at the age of 93, her vast inheritance long since gone. The pocket Venus, who had saved Highclere with her father's money, died in ordinary circumstances, the fortune spent, the castle a memory. And the castle she left behind slid slowly toward ruin. The enormous staff was never rebuilt. The house that had needed dozens of servants to run was kept going by a fraction of that. And a building of some 300 rooms, of stone and lead and timber, needs constant, costly attention simply to keep standing, and that attention grew harder and harder to afford. The roof let in the weather. Damp crept into the walls. Stone crumbled and was not repaired. Whole sections of the house were closed off and left to decay in the dark. Almina's later life is a strange footnote to all this grandeur, and a fitting one. The woman who had come to Highclere with a banker's fortune behind her, who had cleared an earl's debts and refloated his estate and turned his castle into a hospital, spent her final decades with the great fortune gone. It had been vast, almost beyond counting, and it had been spent on the house, on Egypt, on the hospital, on a way of life that consumed money faster than even a Rothschild fortune could supply. She died in a hospital far from any castle, an old woman whose money had run out, and the house she had once saved was by then sliding into decay. For the castle itself, the middle of the century was a long twilight. Great country houses across Britain were being pulled down in these years at a rate that is hard to believe, one every few days at the worst of it, their contents auctioned, their stone carted away, their parks turned over to farming or left to go wild. Highclere did not come down, but it came close to the condition that preceded so many demolitions, a great house too large to heat, too costly to mend, with more rooms than anyone could use, and a repair bill mounting into the millions. It stood, but it stood the way a great old tree stands after the life has begun to leave it, magnificent still from a distance, hollowing quietly within. By the early years of the 21st century, the crisis was severe. Surveys of the building found that it needed repairs on a staggering scale, something on the order of £12 million of major work, with part of that classed as urgent, needed simply to stop the decay from becoming irreversible. Around 50 of the castle's rooms had become uninhabitable, shut up and rotting behind closed doors, under leaking roofs and past crumbling stone. The most famous house in England, the future star of the most beloved period drama in the world, was quietly following the same road that had already destroyed so many of its peers. It was becoming too expensive to keep standing. Decay in a great house is a quiet and patient thing. It does not announce itself. It begins with a slipped tile and a stain on a ceiling, a window that will not quite close, a smell of damp in a corridor no one uses. Left unmended, because mending costs money the family no longer has, each small failure invites a larger one. Water finds its way in and does not leave. Timber softens, plaster falls. A room is closed off because it can no longer be used, and then another, and the closed rooms become a wing, and the wing becomes a floor, and the life of the house shrinks back toward the few rooms that can still be kept warm and dry. That is how a castle dies, not in an afternoon, but across decades, one closed door at a time. Here is the plain scale of that decline, the numbers that measure a slow death. A house of around 300 rooms, some 50 of them past saving without major work. A repair bill of about £12 million, a family fortune that had come from outside and left with a remarriage, an indoor staff that had once run to dozens, reduced to a handful. Every figure points the same way, toward a great shell too grand to live in and too costly to mend, the exact fate that the death duties and the war and the servant shortage had prepared for it across half a century. It would have been a fitting and terrible end. The house that had hidden its workers so completely, brought down at last, not by any drama, but by simple arithmetic, its roofs open to the rain, its rooms rotting, its hidden world long scattered. That is very nearly how the story of Highclere ended, in quiet decay. One more great house too expensive to save. And then, at almost the last possible moment, it was rescued by the most unlikely savior imaginable, and by a version of itself that had never actually existed. Chapter 13. Saved by the fantasy it never was. The house was rescued at the last, and it was rescued by the very story that got it most wrong. In 2010, a new television series began filming at Highclere Castle, a gentle, sumptuous drama about an aristocratic family and their servants in the early years of the 20th century. It was called Downton Abbey, and it made the decaying Hampshire house, almost overnight, one of the most recognized buildings on the face of the earth. The effect was extraordinary. People the world over came to know Highclere's towered outline, its great hall, its library, its staircase, as the beloved home of a family that had never lived there, in a story that was mostly invention, and they wanted to see it. Visitors came in great numbers from across Britain and, above all, from across the Atlantic, to walk through the rooms they had watched on screen. The films that followed the series brought still more. And all of that, the tickets and the tours and the global fame, brought in exactly the thing the estate had lacked for so long. Money to mend the roof. The income from Downton Abbey and the visitors it drew paid for the repairs the family could never have funded from land or rent. The turrets that had been crumbling were restored. The rooms that had been closed and rotting were brought back. The house that had been dying of its own upkeep was, room by room, made whole again, on the strength of a story about itself. There is no missing the irony, and this film will not pretend to. Highclere was saved by a fiction. The real house, with its hard, hidden history, could not pay to keep itself standing. The fantasy version, warm and gentle and largely untrue, saved it. And think about which part of the fantasy the world fell in love with. Yes, they loved the family, the frocks and the romances and the great rooms. But a huge part of what made Downton Abbey beloved was the world below stairs. The servants, the butler and the housekeeper, and the footmen and the maids, their loyalties and their rivalries, and their small dramas in the kitchen and the servants' hall. The very people the real house had spent a century making invisible were now, in fiction, the stars of the show. Audiences wept over a footman's disappointment and a maid's ambition. The hidden had become the whole point. The transformation was almost absurd in its speed and scale. A house that had been quietly rotting, with dozens of rooms shut up and a repair bill in the millions, became within a few years one of the most visited and photographed private houses on Earth. Coaches of visitors came up the drive that had once carried shooting parties. The rooms the cameras had used were opened to the public, and people who had watched them on a screen in Ohio or California walked through them in person and felt they had come home to a place they had never been. The money followed the fame, and the money did what land and rent no longer could. It mended the roof, it saved the turrets, it brought the closed rooms back to life. And the deepest strangeness of all is what the visitors most wanted to see. Yes, they wanted the grand rooms of the family. But they had fallen in love, above all, with the world below stairs, with the servants and their labours and their small dramas, made warm and vivid and sympathetic on screen. The very people the real house had worked so hard to hide had become, in fiction, the reason the world came knocking. And so the house, to satisfy that love, had to do something it had never done in all its grand history. It had to open the doors to the hidden half of itself and let the paying world walk down the servants' stairs. It would be easy to be sour about this, to dwell on how much the beloved fiction softened and sweetened and simply got wrong about the real life of service. And this film has spent an hour and more insisting on that harder truth. The cold grates and the powdered hair and the faces turned to the wall. But there is something else to say, and it is gentler. The fiction, whatever its errors, sent millions of people looking for the real servants. It made the world curious about the housekeeper's keys and the footman's livery and the scullery maid's raw hands. And that curiosity, in the end, is what paid to save the house, and more than that, changed what the house was for. And there is a kindness in the exchange that is easy to miss beneath the irony. The fiction that saved the house was gentle to the servants in a way the real house never had been. It gave them names and stories and dignity, and made millions of viewers care what became of a housemaid or a valet. It softened the truth, yes. But it also, for the first time, put the people below stairs at the center of the story rather than the margins of it, and sent the whole world looking for them. The real servants of Highclere had been made invisible on purpose. Their fictional cousins made them, at last, impossible to ignore. Because the money did not only mend the roof, it reopened the doors. And when Highclere opened itself to all those visitors, it did not only show them the grand staterooms the family had always been proud of. It began, at last, to show them the other house too, the hidden one. And so the story arrives at its final and strangest turn, the one that would have astonished every earl and every steward who ever lived there, the moment the green baize door was propped open on purpose. Chapter 14. The house that hid its workers now sells tickets to their kitchens. Today, the visitors file down the very back stairs the servants once used to stay invisible, and the door that hid them stands propped open. This is the ending no one at the old Highclere could have imagined. The house that was built, quite deliberately, to keep its workers out of sight, now earns its living by showing them off. The kitchens where the maids scalded their hands, the corridors along which the footmen ran with the dishes, the servants' quarters that were designed never to be seen by a guest, are today part of the tour. People pay and come, and are led down the back stairs on purpose to look at the hidden world the family spent a fortune concealing. The green baize door, the border sewn through the middle of the house, the seam between comfort and labour, the barrier that sound and smell and people could cross only in one direction, is open now. It is a curiosity, an exhibit, a thing to be pointed at and photographed. The whole logic of the old house has been turned inside out. What was meant to be invisible is now the attraction. What was meant to be forgotten is now remembered on purpose, for a fee. And there is a justice in that, of a slow and unexpected kind. For a century, the story of Highclere was told entirely from above the green baize door. It was the story of the earls, their marriages and their fortunes, and their famous discovery in the Egyptian sand. The people who actually kept the house alive, the steward Streatfield, and the housekeeper with her keys, and the nameless maids on their knees in the dark, left barely a trace in the official story, exactly as the house had intended. They were the moving parts of a machine built to hide them. And now, at last, they are the reason people come. The house belongs, in the end, as much to them as to the family whose name is on the door. Consider the whole arc of it one more time, in its plain shape. A house built in warm Bath stone to announce a family's greatness and secretly engineered to conceal the army that produced it. A bankrupt title saved by a banker's daughter and £500,000 of Rothschild money. A hidden household of dozens, ruled by a steward more powerful than any butler in fiction, rising before dawn and working past midnight and forbidden to be seen. A fortune poured into the sand, and a master dead of a mosquito bite at the height of his fame. A tax built to break such fortunes, a war that emptied the servants' hall, and a long, slow dying by leaking roof, and then, at the very end, a rescue by a fiction, and the strange final justice of the hidden world thrown open to the light. The grandeur, in the end, was never the point. The grandeur was the disguise. Everything the world admired about this house, the tower against the sky, the library, the effortless ease of the family gliding through their rooms, existed to hide the one thing that actually made it possible, which was the ceaseless, invisible labor of a great many ordinary people. The house was a machine for making that labor disappear, and the final turn of the wheel is that the machine failed at the one thing it was built to do. The workers did not disappear. A century later, they are the very reason the house survives, and the door that was made to hide them stands open for the world to walk through. There is a lesson in that reversal that reaches far beyond one house in Hampshire. For as long as it was a living machine, Highclere spent its wealth and its ingenuity on concealment, on the green baize door and the back stairs and the powdered footman and the rule of the turned face. All of it aimed at making a large population of working people invisible so that a small one might appear to live without effort. It succeeded so well that for a century the servants left almost no trace in the story of the house. And then the world changed, and what the house had hidden became the very thing the world most wanted to see. The people who built and cleaned and cooked and carried, the Streatfields and the housekeepers and the nameless maids, have outlasted the system that tried to erase them. They have their names on no coronet and their faces on no wall, but they are why the coaches come and the tickets sell and the roof holds. The earls got the fame and the tomb and the title. The servants got, in the end, the last word, because the house survives on the world's hunger to know how they lived. It is a strange justice, and a slow one, and it is real. So when the 60 million who think they have already been inside this house come at last to see it for themselves, this is what waits for them, if they know to look. Not only the beautiful rooms of the family, but the cold grate, the narrow stair, the powdered footman's post, the green baize door standing open, the real house behind the famous face, the one that was always there and was never meant to be seen. If a story like this is why you are here, subscribe and stay with me, because there are many more hidden houses and forgotten lives to open up together. And before you go, tell me in the comments, if you had lived below that famous staircase, could you have endured a life spent forbidden to be seen?